The fluorescent lights of Gate 47 cast harsh shadows across the boarding area as passengers shuffled toward the aircraft. The smell of overpriced coffee mixed with anxiety and jet fuel created that unmistakable airport atmosphere. Among the sea of business travelers clutching their laptops and first-class boarding passes, one woman sat quietly in the corner, her modest navy blazer wrinkled from the long day of travel. When they dragged her off that plane, kicking and screaming wasn't her style, but what happened next would cost them everything. Dr. Amelia Richardson adjusted her worn leather briefcase and checked her boarding pass one final time. Seat 23C, middle seat, economy. She'd flown this route dozens of times, always in the back, always unnoticed. The flight attendants barely glanced her way as she moved down the narrow aisle, her presence as invisible as the hundreds of other passengers who passed through these metal tubes daily. "Excuse me, ma'am. You're going to need to move." The flight attendant's voice carried that practiced politeness that barely concealed irritation. Amelia looked up from settling into her assigned seat, confused. "I'm sorry, is there a problem with my seat? We've had to make some adjustments for our premium passengers. You'll need to take a seat in the back." The flight attendant gestured vaguely toward the rear of the plane, where a few middle seats remained empty. Amelia glanced at her boarding pass, then at the seat number above her head, 23C, exactly where she belonged. "But this is my assigned seat. I checked in online and, ma'am, we don't want to cause a scene." The flight attendant's smile tightened. "If you could just cooperate, we can get everyone settled and take off on time." The passengers around her had gone quiet, some stealing glances while others studiously avoided eye contact. Amelia felt the familiar weight of being the only black woman in a space where she clearly didn't belong, at least not in anyone else's mind. She gathered her belongings slowly, maintaining the dignity that had carried her through countless moments like this. As she moved toward the back, she heard a passenger mutter, "Finally." Some people just don't understand how things work. What they didn't know was that Dr. Amelia Richardson understood exactly how things work. She understood complex financial structures, international trade agreements, and billion-dollar mergers better than anyone on that plane. She understood the delicate balance of power that kept certain people in certain places, and with just one phone call she was about to make from the back of that aircraft, she was about to demonstrate exactly how well she understood the system that had just humiliated her, because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone assumes doesn't belong. There. If this story moves you, hit that subscribe button. We share incredible stories of overlooked heroes every week. Rate this story from 0 to 10 in the comments and tell us about a time you witnessed hidden talent being dismissed. Your stories matter, and they inspire our next videos. What would you do if you had the power to change everything in that moment? Dr. Amelia Richardson had been making this flight from Atlanta to New York for 8 years, every month without fail. She always booked economy, always arrived early, always kept to herself. The gate agents processed her ticket with the same mechanical efficiency they showed every passenger. The flight attendants served her the same pretzels and ginger ale without a second glance. Corporate executives in their tailored suits brushed past her in the jet bridge, their voices carrying discussions of mergers, acquisitions, and market disruptions. They clutched their platinum status boarding passes and disappeared into first class. Where warm towels and real glasses awaited them, Amelia watched it all from seat 23C, or whatever middle seat she'd been assigned that month. She watched the power dynamics play out in the narrow aisles, the casual dismissal of anyone who didn't fit the expected profile of success. She observed how authority was assumed, how respect was distributed, how invisible barriers were maintained without anyone ever acknowledging they existed. The irony wasn't lost on her. These same executives, rushing past her to their leather seats and hot towels, would spend the flight preparing for meetings where they'd discuss companies, deals and strategies that she had architected from behind the scenes. But here, 30,000 feet above the ground, she was just another passenger in a wrinkled blazer. On this particular Tuesday morning, Amelia had noticed the tension before boarding even began. The gate agent kept glancing at his computer screen with growing frustration. She'd overheard fragments of conversation about VIP passengers and last-minute changes and corporate priorities. The usual dance of airline hierarchy was more frantic than usual. When she'd finally boarded and settled into 23C, Amelia had pulled out her phone to review the presentation she'd been perfecting for months. The screen showed complex charts detailing market analysis, competitive positioning, and growth projections. Her fingers moved across financial models that represented years of research and millions of dollars in potential revenue. The flight attendant appeared beside her with that practiced smile. "Excuse me, ma'am. You're going to need to move." Amelia looked up from her phone, where a document titled Richardson Industries Q4 Strategic Review glowed on the screen. She quickly minimized it. "I'm sorry, is there a problem with my seat?" The explanation about premium passengers and adjustments felt rehearsed, like a script the crew had been instructed to follow. Amelia's eyes moved from the flight attendant to the first-class cabin, where she could see empty seats, then back to the gate agent who was avoiding her gaze. "But this is my assigned seat. I checked in online and, ma'am, we don't want to cause a scene." The phrase hit her like a physical blow. She'd heard variations of it her entire career. Don't cause a scene when you're the only black face in the boardroom. Don't cause a scene when your ideas are credited to someone else. Don't cause a scene when opportunities slip away without explanation. As she gathered her belongings, Amelia's phone buzzed with a message from her assistant. BoardCorp executives confirmed for 2 p.m. meeting. They're expecting final recommendation on the merger proposal. This could be the biggest deal in company history. She looked at the message, then at the passengers around her who had returned to their conversations and magazines as if nothing had happened. The man in 23A was reading the Wall Street Journal, a headline about corporate acquisitions visible above the fold. The woman in 23B was typing on her laptop, financial spreadsheets flickering across the screen. None of them knew that the woman being asked to move to the back of the plane was about to walk into the most important meeting of her career. None of them realized that her recommendation in that conference room would determine the fate of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in assets. But as Amelia walked toward the rear of the aircraft, her phone still clutched in her hand, something had shifted inside her. The familiar acceptance of casual humiliation was being replaced by something else. Something that had been building for 8 years of monthly flights, 8 years of being invisible, 8 years of watching power and privilege flow around her while she remained perfectly, professionally quiet. That was about to change. 20 minutes after takeoff, the situation escalated beyond anyone's expectations. Amelia had settled into her new seat near the back galley, trying to focus on her presentation materials despite the constant traffic of passengers using the restroom. The seat beside her was occupied by an elderly gentleman who kept apologizing for being moved as well, whispering that he'd never experienced anything like this in 40 years of flying. The flight attendants seemed increasingly agitated, huddled in whispered conversations near the galley. Amelia caught fragments. Corporate called directly, and had to accommodate. And you know how these VIP situations work. Then she heard her name. Richardson. Yes, that's her. The lead flight attendant was speaking in hushed tones to someone on the aircraft phone. She's been moved to 34D. No, she didn't cause any problems, but... The voice trailed off as the attendant noticed Amelia listening. Something cold settled in Amelia's stomach. They knew her name. This wasn't just a random seat reassignment for a premium passenger. Someone had specifically requested that she be moved. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from her assistant, Sarah. "Dr. Richardson, I'm sorry to bother you on your flight, but something strange is happening. I just got a call from BoardCorp's legal team. They're asking about your travel arrangements today and whether you're planning to attend the meeting." Amelia kept her voice low. "Of course I'm attending the meeting. Why would they think otherwise? That's what I told them, but they seemed, I don't know, surprised? Like they expected you to cancel. And Dr. Richardson, there's something else. Marcus Webb's assistant called an hour ago asking if we could reschedule because, and I quote, 'there might be some travel complications that could delay Dr. Richardson's arrival.' Marcus Webb, senior partner at Webb & Associates, BoardCorp's primary legal counsel. The man who had been undermining her recommendations for months, pushing for a merger that would benefit his firm's other clients, while devastating the communities that depended on the companies involved. Amelia's hands tightened around her phone. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. "Sarah, I need you to do something for me. Check the passenger manifest for this flight. Find out who else from our industry is on board." While she waited, Amelia noticed two men in expensive suits making their way down the aisle toward first class. She recognized them immediately. Richard Morrison and James Hartford, both senior executives from Pinnacle Industries, the company that stood to gain the most from the merger she was supposed to recommend against. They didn't glance in her direction as they passed, but she heard Morrison say to Hartford, "Problem solved. Richardson won't be a factor in this afternoon's decision." The casual cruelty of it took her breath away. They had orchestrated this entire situation. The seat reassignment, the humiliation, the delay. It was all designed to keep her from the meeting, or at least to ensure she arrived flustered, diminished, and off balance. Sarah's voice crackled through the phone. "Dr. Richardson, you're not going to believe this. There are 6 BoardCorp board members on your flight, all in first class, and Marcus Webb upgraded to business class this morning. It looks like they're all planning to arrive together for an early meeting." Amelia closed her eyes, feeling the full weight of the conspiracy. They had planned to sideline her, to hold the meeting without her input, to push through the merger that would make them rich while destroying the lives of the workers and communities she had spent months studying. "There's more," Sarah continued. "I just checked your reservation. Someone from Webb's office called yesterday requesting a seat change for you. They told the airline you had requested to be moved to the back of the plane for a quieter work environment." The elderly gentleman beside her was staring now, having caught enough of the conversation to understand that something serious was happening. Amelia met his eyes and saw not judgment, but anger on her behalf. "Ma'am," he whispered, "I don't know who you are or what they're trying to do to you, but I've been in business for 40 years. What they just did to you isn't right." Amelia looked at her phone, at the presentation that represented months of research and millions of dollars in consequences. Then she looked toward first class, where the people who had orchestrated her humiliation were probably toasting their success with premium champagne. For 8 years, she had accepted this treatment. She had stayed quiet, stayed professional, stayed in her place. Not today. In the privacy of the airplane bathroom, Amelia stared at her reflection in the small mirror. The fluorescent lighting was harsh, unforgiving, but her eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there an hour ago. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a contact she hadn't called in 3 years. "Dad, Richardson Industries." Dr. William Richardson answered on the first ring. "Amelia? Aren't you supposed to be in a meeting right now?" "Dad, I need to tell you something. About the BoardCorp recommendation. About why I took this consulting contract." She took a deep breath, steadying herself against the cramped bathroom wall. "I've been trying to handle this quietly, professionally. But I think it's time they knew exactly who they're dealing with." There was a pause. "Sweetheart, you've been handling things quietly your whole career. Sometimes quiet isn't enough." Her father was right. Dr. William Richardson had built Richardson. Industries from a small regional consulting firm into one of the most respected strategic advisory companies in the country. When Amelia was 16, he had won a landmark case that prevented a major corporation from closing factories in 3 states, saving over 10,000 jobs. She had watched him testify before Congress, his quiet dignity and razor-sharp intellect dismantling the arguments of executives who had never considered the human cost of their decisions. "You know, I was proud when you decided to work independently," her father continued, "building your own reputation, not trading on the family name. But Amelia, there comes a time when you have to use every tool in your arsenal." She thought about the presentation on her phone. Months of meticulous research that would prove the BoardCorp merger was not just financially questionable, but ethically indefensible. She had documented how the deal would close manufacturing plants in rural communities, eliminate pension benefits for thousands of retirees, and concentrate market power in ways that would ultimately harm consumers. More importantly, she had uncovered evidence that several board members, including those sitting in first class right now, stood to profit personally from the merger through hidden investments and consulting agreements. It was all legal, technically, but it represented exactly the kind of corporate self-dealing that destroyed public trust and harmed vulnerable communities. They moved me to the back of the plane. Dad! Had me humiliated in front of everyone because they thought it would throw me off my game for the meeting. And how's that working out for them? Despite everything, Amelia smiled. Not well. Good. Your mother would be proud, you know. She never let anyone put her in a box. Never let them make her small. Dr. Sarah Richardson had been a federal judge, one of the first black women appointed to the bench in their state. She had died when Amelia was in college, but her influence had shaped every decision Amelia had made since. Her mother had taught her that dignity wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about knowing when to fight and fighting smart. I have enough evidence to stop this merger and probably trigger a federal investigation, Amelia said. But if I do this, there's no going back to invisible consulting. Everyone will know who I am. Honey, you're a Richardson. They should have known who you were the moment you walked in the room. After the call ended, Amelia remained in the bathroom for another moment, thinking about the path that had led her here. She had spent her career deliberately staying in the background, building expertise without seeking credit, solving problems without demanding recognition. It had been a strategic choice, a way to access information and opportunities that might have been closed to her if she had carried the Richardson name and everything it represented. But somewhere along the way, being invisible had become a prison. She had become so accustomed to being overlooked that she had started to collaborate in her own invisibility. The merger decision was about more than money or corporate strategy. It was about whether power would continue to concentrate in the hands of people who saw workers and communities as expendable, or whether someone would finally stand up and say enough. When she returned to her seat, the elderly gentleman looked at her with concern. "Are you all right, dear?" "I am now," she said, pulling out her phone and opening her contact list. "In fact, I'm about to make some very important phone calls." The first call was to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The second was to the Department of Justice. The third was to the editor of the Wall Street Journal. By the time they landed in New York, the entire financial world would know exactly who Dr. Amelia Richardson was, and the BoardCorp executives in first class would have much bigger problems than a delayed merger meeting. The cabin was still humming with the gentle noise of the engines when Amelia made the first call. She kept her voice low, professional, deadly calm. "This is Dr. Amelia Richardson calling for Director Martinez at the SEC. "Yes, I'll hold." The elderly gentleman beside her had become her unlikely ally, occasionally nodding encouragingly as he overheard fragments of her conversation. What he didn't know was that he was witnessing the careful dismantling of a billion-dollar conspiracy. "Director Martinez, I'm calling to report suspected securities violations in connection with the proposed BoardCorp Pinnacle merger. I have documentation of undisclosed conflicts of interest and potential market manipulation. She paused, listening. Yes, I can have the full report to you within 2 hours. I'm also copying the Justice Department and providing simultaneous disclosure to the Wall Street Journal. From first class, she could hear the occasional burst of laughter. The conspirators were celebrating too early. Her second call went to Assistant Attorney General Patricia Chen, whom she had worked with on previous corporate fraud cases. Patricia, it's Amelia Richardson. I need to report potential RICO violations. Yes, that's serious. While she talked, Amelia's fingers flew across her phone screen, forwarding encrypted documents to secure servers, copying financial analysts, and sending preliminary alerts to regulatory agencies across 3 states. Every email was time-stamped, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence. "Sarah," she said when her assistant answered, "I need you to execute Protocol 7. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Protocol 7 was something they had never actually implemented. A comprehensive media and regulatory disclosure strategy designed for exactly this kind of situation. Sarah had helped design it but never imagined they would need it. "Dr. Richardson, are you sure? Once we do this, there's no putting it back in the box." "I'm sure. Release everything. The financial analysis, the conflict of interest documentation, the communications records. Send it simultaneously to the SEC, DOJ, and every financial journalist on our priority list." "What about the board corp meeting?" Amelia glanced toward first class, where she could see the back of Marcus Webb's head. He was probably rehearsing his presentation, confident that he would be delivering it to a room where the most dangerous voice had been silenced. "Oh, I'll be at the meeting," she said. "In fact, call them and let them know that Dr. Amelia Richardson of Richardson Industries will be presenting additional materials that will require extended discussion." The silence on the phone was profound. "Richardson Industries? Dr. Richardson, I thought you were consulting independently." "I am, but I'm also the daughter of William Richardson. And today seemed like a good day to remind everyone of exactly what that means." Her third call was to James Morrison at the Wall Street Journal. Morrison had been covering corporate corruption for 15 years, and he had been waiting for a story like this. "Jim, it's Amelia Richardson. I have something for you, but you need to be ready to publish immediately upon landing." She could hear him scrambling for a recorder. "I'm sending you documentation of a conspiracy to manipulate a major merger through regulatory capture, board manipulation, and systematic exclusion of opposing analysis." "How big are we talking?" "Billion-dollar merger, federal crimes, 6 board members, and enough evidence to trigger congressional hearings." "Jesus, Amelia. What did you stumble into?" "I didn't stumble into anything. They dragged me into it when they had me humiliated on an airplane because they thought it would keep me quiet." By the time the plane began its descent into LaGuardia, Amelia had spoken with regulators in 3 federal agencies, 4 journalists, and 2 congressional staffers. Her phone was buzzing constantly with return calls and requests for additional information. The flight attendant who had moved her earlier passed by her row, no longer making eye contact. Word was apparently spreading through the cabin that something significant was happening. Passengers were checking their phones and whispering among themselves. From first class, she could hear Marcus Webb's voice rising in what sounded like an urgent phone conversation. "What do you mean the meeting might be delayed?" "We had everything arranged." The elderly gentleman beside her leaned over. "Ma'am, I don't know what you do for a living, but whatever just happened, I think you just changed some very important people's lives." "I hope so," Amelia replied, watching the New York skyline come into view. Some changes are long overdue. As the plane touched down, her phone rang one final time. It was her father. "Amelia, I just got 3 calls from reporters asking for comment about Richardson Industries' involvement in the Board Corp investigation. Whatever you just did up there, the whole financial world is about to know about it." She looked toward first class, where several passengers were now standing and talking in agitated clusters. "Good," she said. "It's time they learned that when you try to humiliate someone, you better make sure you know who you're dealing with first." The moment they entered the terminal, everything changed. Amelia was still walking up the jet bridge when she heard her name being called by someone she didn't recognize. A reporter with a camera crew, apparently tipped off by the breaking news alerts that had begun circulating during the flight. "Dr. Richardson! Can you comment on the federal investigation you've just triggered?" Behind her, she could hear the commotion from first class. Marcus Webb was speaking urgently into his phone. "What do you mean there are federal agents at the office? We haven't done anything wrong." Richard Morrison pushed past several passengers, his face flushed with anger, and something that looked like panic. "This is insane," he muttered to James Hartford. How did she know? At the gate, Amelia was met by Sarah, her assistant, who looked both excited and terrified. "Dr. Richardson, your phone has been ringing non-stop. The SEC wants to meet with you immediately. The Journal is holding space for a front-page story. And," she paused, checking her notes, "Board Corp has requested an emergency postponement of this afternoon's meeting." "Declined," Amelia said simply. "We're going to that meeting as scheduled. But they're saying they need time to review new information and—" "Sarah, they had plenty of time to review information. They chose to ignore it because they thought they could ignore me." She adjusted her blazer, the same wrinkled navy jacket that had made her invisible just hours earlier. Today, they're going to listen to every word. The ride into Manhattan took place in a black sedan that Sarah had arranged, and Amelia spent the time fielding calls from reporters, regulators, and several very nervous Board Corp executives who were suddenly eager to hear her thoughts on the merger. "Dr. Richardson, this is Gerald Hawthorne from Board Corp's legal department. We understand there may have been some miscommunication about this afternoon's meeting." "There was no miscommunication. Mr. Hawthorne, your colleagues arranged to have me humiliated and removed from my assigned seat because they believed it would prevent me from attending the meeting where I would recommend against their fraudulent merger. What they failed to understand is that humiliating someone and silencing them are two very different things." So, pause on the other end was long enough to suggest that emergency legal consultations were taking place in real time. "Perhaps we could arrange a preliminary discussion before the full board meeting." "No, we'll have the discussion we scheduled. With the full board, with my complete presentation, and with federal regulators in attendance as observers." "Federal regulators?" "Oh yes, the SEC and Justice Department are very interested in this merger now. Something about the timing of their interest coinciding with your attempts to manipulate the process." When she arrived at the Board Corp building, the scene was unlike anything she had experienced in her consulting career. Federal agents were in the lobby, interviewing employees and reviewing documents. Camera crews from 3 networks were stationed outside. The building's usual atmosphere of corporate confidence had been replaced by barely controlled chaos. In the elevator, she rode with 2 FBI agents who were comparing notes about financial records they had seized that morning. They nodded politely but said nothing, though she noticed one of them glance at her with recognition. The boardroom was a study in contrasts when she arrived. On one side sat the executives who had orchestrated her airplane humiliation: Marcus Webb, Richard Morrison, James Hartford, and 3 others who had been in first class that morning. They looked like defendants waiting for a verdict. On the other side sat federal regulators, taking notes and recording everything for later review. At the head of the table, Board Corp CEO Jennifer Walsh looked like she had aged 5 years in the past 4 hours. "Dr. Richardson, I believe we owe you an apology for this morning's irregularities." Amelia set her briefcase on the table and opened it slowly. Inside was the same presentation she had been reviewing when she was forced to move seats, but now it carried the weight of federal investigation behind it. "Ms. Walsh, You don't owe me an apology. You owe the workers whose jobs you were planning to eliminate an apology. You owe the communities you were planning to destroy an apology. You owe the shareholders you were planning to defraud an apology. She pulled out a thick folder and placed it in front of her. What you owe me is your complete attention while I explain exactly how close you all came to committing federal crimes this afternoon. Marcus Webb started to speak. Now, see here. Mr. Webb, Amelia interrupted, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had been invisible to them just hours earlier. You already tried to silence me once today. How did that work out for you? The room fell silent. For the first time in her career, everyone was listening. The presentation lasted 3 hours and 17 minutes. When Amelia finished, the silence in the boardroom was absolute. She had systematically dismantled every assumption, every projection, and every justification the merger proponents had offered. More devastating, she had documented a pattern of self-dealing and market manipulation that painted several board members as active participants in a conspiracy to defraud shareholders and destroy communities. For personal profit, the financial models you've been shown, she said, gesturing to the wall screen where her analysis was displayed, deliberately hide the true cost of this merger. Plant closures, pension defaults, and market consolidation will ultimately cost the American economy over $3 billion in lost productivity and wages. She clicked to the next slide. More importantly, 6 members of this board stand to profit personally from these closures through investments in overseas manufacturing and real estate speculation in the affected communities. Richard Morrison had grown increasingly pale as the presentation continued. These are completely unfounded accusations. Mr. Morrison, I have copies of your investment portfolio, your real estate transactions, and your communications with foreign manufacturers dating back 18 months. The SEC has the same information, and they're very interested in the timing of your investments relative to merger discussions. Agent Patricia Chen, observing for the Justice Department, leaned forward. Dr. Richardson, are you prepared to testify to these findings under oath? I am. And I should mention that Richardson Industries will be filing a whistleblower complaint with the SEC seeking damages and penalties under federal fraud statutes. The transformation in the room was remarkable. The same executives who had engineered her humiliation that morning were now scrambling to distance themselves from the merger proposal. Marcus Webb, who had smirked as she was moved to the back of the plane, was now asking his assistant to check flight schedules out of the city. BoardCorp CEO Jennifer Walsh looked like she was staring into an abyss. Dr. Richardson, if we were to table the merger proposal pending further review, Ms. Walsh, you're not going to table anything. The merger is dead. Your board members who participated in this conspiracy will likely face federal charges. And BoardCorp will spend the next several years rebuilding its credibility under federal oversight. She closed her laptop and stood up. But there is something positive that can come from this. The room waited. I'm prepared to offer BoardCorp a different path forward. Richardson Industries will provide strategic consulting to help you restructure your operations in ways that strengthen communities instead of destroying them. We'll help you develop manufacturing partnerships that create jobs instead of eliminating them. We'll show you how sustainable business practices actually generate better long-term returns than predatory extraction. She looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. But it will require something that seems to be difficult for this industry, treating workers and communities as partners rather than obstacles. The meeting ended with federal agents arranging interviews with several board members, journalists requesting exclusive access to the story, and BoardCorp's legal team beginning the complex process of unwinding a conspiracy that had taken months to construct. As Amelia packed her briefcase, Jennifer Walsh approached her privately. Dr. Richardson, I had no idea who you were this morning. I mean, I knew your reputation as a consultant, but I didn't realize that I was William Richardson's daughter. That Richardson Industries has been fighting corporate corruption for 30 years? Amelia smiled, but not unkindly. Ms. Walsh, that was the point. I built my independent reputation because I wanted my work to speak for itself, not my family name. And now? Now I realize that sometimes you have to use every tool in your arsenal. Sometimes being invisible isn't strategic, it's just invisible. Outside the building, the camera crews were waiting. For the first time in her career, Dr. Amelia Richardson stepped in front of the cameras not as an anonymous expert, but as herself. The airline incident this morning was designed to humiliate and silence me, she told the reporter. What the people who planned it failed to understand is that you can't silence someone who has truth on their side. You can only make them louder. The story led every business news program that evening. By the following morning, 3 congressional subcommittees had announced investigations. The SEC had filed formal charges, and Richardson Industries' phone was ringing with requests from communities and workers across the country who had heard that someone was finally fighting for them. The woman, who had been dragged to the back of the plane, had become the voice that corporate America could no longer ignore. 6 months later, Dr. Amelia Richardson still flies commercial, but things have changed. Flight attendants recognize her now, not because she demands special treatment, but because her story has become legendary in corporate circles. She still books economy seats, still travels with her worn leather briefcase, still maintains the quiet dignity that had made her invisible for so many years. But invisible is no longer a word anyone would use to describe her. Richardson Industries has tripled in size, taking on cases across the country where corporate power has run unchecked. The BoardCorp case resulted in $2.3 billion in penalties and the creation of a federal task force dedicated to preventing merger fraud. Marcus Webb and 4 other conspirators received federal prison sentences. The communities that would have been devastated by plant closures instead saw new investment and job growth under the restructuring plan Amelia designed. Every morning, she reviews case files while sipping coffee in her office, where a framed boarding pass from Flight 1247 hangs on the wall. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Young analysts seek her guidance, and she tells them what she learned that day at 30,000 feet. Your voice doesn't become powerful when people recognize you. It becomes powerful when you recognize yourself. The airplane incident taught America something important about assumptions, about who deserves respect, and about the cost of humiliating people whose worth you haven't bothered to discover. It revealed how easily systems of power can be manipulated when we assume that authority always knows best. And it demonstrated what happens when someone with both expertise and integrity refuses to be silenced. Her story reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone assumes doesn't belong there. The quiet woman in the wrinkled blazer, the overlooked expert in the middle seat, the voice that power tries to silence. These are often the people with the most important things to say. What hidden talents are you overlooking in your own life? What voices are you failing to hear because they don't match your expectations of authority or expertise? Share your thoughts below, because the next person you underestimate might just change everything. Sometimes the flight gets delayed. Sometimes the person you try to silence has the power to ground your entire operation. And sometimes justice looks like a woman with a worn briefcase who refuses to stay in the back of the plane.